Hi there, welcome to another episode on Pascal's China Lens. Now, for those of you who follow me regularly, you probably noticed for the past 2 months I haven't been making videos or posting them on YouTube. The reason is simple. I mean, since China opened up, I've been pretty busy, but on top of that, I'm renovating my home, and so for 2 months I didn't have a studio at home, which meant it was much more difficult for me to make these videos. But from now on, as you can see, I'm back and I'll make more videos from now on. Today I want to talk about a specific subject. I want to talk about the planet and how I believe India and China will save the planet. Now, I believe the commitment of both countries and the intention and the reality of them achieving that goal is actually higher than in the West. And this is a story I want to talk about. Now, you could say in a way, China and India are really polluting a lot, but on the other hand, if you look cumulatively in the past, historically, China and India have been polluting very little compared to America or Europe. In America, we're talking about 29% of all the cumulative CO2 being emitted into the atmosphere coming from that one region. If we look at Europe, we're talking about 33%. If we only look at the European Union, we're talking about 22%, which is almost double of what China did with 12.7%, or India is only 3%. So what's clear is historically, I mean, China and India could claim, well, we have another decade or two that we can pollute as much as we want before we reach the levels that you guys in the industrial countries have started to pollute over time. But the reality is that doesn't make any sense, because we shouldn't look at the past, we should look at the future, otherwise we're not going to save the planet. The other thing that we could look at is per capita. If you look at per person, and of course China and India have 1.4 billion people, then what you see is that America is contributing twice as much in CO2 tons per person than China. I mean, if you look at it, with the same GDP almost, Americans are actually contributing to 15.2 tons per capita, while China is only at 7.4. Europe is a little bit less than China, it's at 6.4. And of course, if you look at India, it's only at 1.8. What that means is that per capita, per person, China and India could claim, well, we could pollute 4 times or 2 times more and still be better off than America. Now, of course, again, this doesn't make any sense, because it's not a per capita that you need to look at. You need to look at the total, because ultimately the planet's not going to be safe because some countries are polluting more than others. It's because the total is polluting more in total. Now, if you look at the factory of the world, which is China, it's very clear that the CO2 emission of China alone is as big as the whole Americas, from Canada all the way to Ushuaia and Chile and Peru, all in the south. And so this is huge. And so China is contributing to 27% of all the CO2 into the atmosphere today. That is more than twice as much as America. And if you look at Europe and you look at India, we're talking about 6.4 and 6.5%, 6.6%. What that means is that China is really the biggest issue. On the other hand, India, which is the third on the list, is actually the fastest growing in pollution on the planet as well. So this is really an issue. And if China and India are not going to get their act together, I mean, we're going to be in trouble for saving the planet. Now, the problem of China and India is primarily coal. Why is coal a problem? Because it's still, for China, 50% of its contribution or capacity of energy that actually they are generating in that country. And so this is huge. And although it's declining every year, it actually is still almost half of their whole capacity and whole energy production. For India, we're talking about almost 12%. So together of the world, the whole world, actually 60% of all the coal production is coming from those 2 countries. And so this is an issue. On top of that, if you look at China itself or India itself, I mean, there's an existential problem, an urgency even. Because I've lived in Shanghai for 18 years, and I can tell you about 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, when I was living in Shanghai, many days I didn't want to go out for jogging or playing tennis. That's one of the sports I do, because ultimately the smog was just too bad. My daughter, there were times that She couldn't go to school because the pollution was just so bad and didn't have the air purification systems in the schools. So what I'm saying here is that you do not need to explain to Chinese what pollution is all about. You do not need to explain to Chinese that there is actually a climate issue and that global warming is happening. You do not need to explain the same thing to Indians, because Delhi, for example, or New Delhi, is actually the biggest polluter or polluted city on the planet for 4 straight years in a row. And so there's huge problems, and they just see the pollution. They don't need to talk about it. Well, we in the West, we often talk about it, but we don't really see it as much. I've never experienced in Belgium, where I'm from, the same thing as I've experienced in Shanghai. And so there's an existential urgency. And the government, but also the people, they get it. And because they get it, some things are happening. But it's going more than existential urgency. What it also is about, it's not just about pollution, it's about livelihood. If you look at China, for example, I mean, there's many droughts. Last year was the biggest drought of all. I mean, no rainfall at all in many big regions, but at other times and in other regions, there was so much rainfall that actually people got displaced, people got killed, and the same in Pakistan and India. I mean, terrible situations where millions of people lost their homes, their houses, and so this is a real issue. And so for many people in the rural areas in China and in India, so outside of the cities, I mean, this is more than just a theory or something that politicians are talking. It's about their crops, it's about their livelihood. And the biggest issue is actually the unpredictability of these things. What that means is that for many people in India, and we're talking about probably 50% of the population, not knowing when it's going to rain, how much it's going to rain, is actually critical for their livelihood. The problem in India for the past 70 years has been that the amount of extreme rainfall has tripled over the past 70 years, but the total rainfall over the year has actually decreased. And so that means that 70% of all the families in India, households in India, are affected directly or indirectly by rain falling too much or too little. The same is happening in the rural areas in China. And so this is really about survival. And I think once a country, once a civilization, once a population understands that what's happening to the planet has to do with survival, then there's actually a mindset change as well. And this is what's happening in these two countries. With us in the West, in Europe, in America, most of the people, we don't feel it as much. I mean, there are disasters, but they're usually very local. We talk about it in the news, but it's not that the whole country is affected. This is why I believe in 2015, with the Paris Accords, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi were really committed to reach these climate goals that they actually foresaw. For China, it means by 2060 being climate neutral. For India, it means by 2070. Knowing that this is a huge endeavor for these countries, actually it's a pretty tough goal to reach. But I'm quite confident both these countries are going to get there. Now, why am I so confident about that? If you look at China and India, I mean, they couldn't be more different. From a political system, I mean, the world sees China as an autocratic dictatorship, while they see India as the biggest democracy in the world. So from a political point of view, you could say, I mean, these countries are different, so why would they both be using the same models? But what's interesting to look at China and India is actually how the leadership, so that's Modi and Xi Jinping, have a lot of resemblance when it is to tackle large and huge and incredible problems. And I believe the resemblance of those two leaders and leadership of them is much bigger than the differences. And I know many people watching my video here from China or from India will now say, well, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi have nothing similar. They're completely different. They're opposites, people will even say. But I believe when we look at their leadership and the way they can enforce certain things, I think we're getting very close to similarity. Let me explain a little bit how I see the similarity of both. First thing, both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi have actually created a personality cult around them. What that means is that people will follow these leaders and trust these leaders to guide them into a better future. Now, we can debate about it if it's true or not, but the reality is that the personality cult that they've created is huge, which means hundreds and hundreds of millions of people actually believe that they're really willing to do good to keep the society sustainable and to have common prosperity for all its population, for most of the population in the next decade or decades to come. And so that trust is actually critical. Now, in China, of course, with the lockdowns in 2022, it had some issues, but reality is that most of the people still trust in the leadership of getting them into a better life towards the future. Now, the other thing which I think is very interesting to look at is the past. The past of both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, what you see is that both of them actually have learned and have lived in their past, specifically when they were young, through hardship. I mean, they had to do tough jobs to get there, and it took a lot of effort, and it wasn't easy, and they were surrounded with people that actually were the poorest of all, people that were not special, not the elite. I mean, these were normal people, normal citizens, hundreds of millions of them in China and in India, that now believe that these leaders actually have a connection, are sensitive to their problems, specifically when the problems come from outside them. And so this gives them a sense of trust and a sense of empathy. And I think that's important for both leaders to actually lead the country and have the population to support them into the future. The other thing has to do with how they got to power. And I think there's a lot of resemblance there too. I mean, both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi have gotten through the ranks, and it took a lot of time basically to get better and better and better, and both of them are now the longest serving leaders, serving governors of the country for a long, long time. And so what that means is that both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi actually are very strong administrators, very tough administrators. They've been fighting corruption, and that is the basic to get a problem solved, specifically when it's about corporate corruption. I mean, this is where a lot of the pollution, a lot of the environmental damage has been done. And so both of them really feel that they've gotten the trust of the government, the trust of the political system to actually lead the country towards the future. And it's all about just and honest and so on. And so I do believe both of them have actually this belief from the government and from citizens to actually lead them into that future. And that is something we don't see in the West. I mean, where I'm from in Belgium, I don't see many politicians having that same trust to lead the country into a better future. And then there's the cultural past, and I think that's interesting too, because if we look at the culture, it's very clear that both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi care a lot about the culture and the pride that the country has today. Today, both India and China, or Indians and Chinese, are extremely proud to be Indian or to be Chinese. And they're proud, they're almost nationalistic, specifically when we look at it from an economic point of view. They really want to move forward and stand there and be rejuvenated in terms of countries where they used to be 200 years ago. They want to be leading again and showing the example. And I think saving the planet is one of the main topics on the agenda to show that they're actually doing good, because their culture has shown them so in the past. So you see, there's a lot of things that actually lead to these two leaders having the trust of the population. But it's mostly about the optimism and the hardship that 1.4 billion people, both in India and China, are willing to go through in order to actually make life better. And having that kind of a support is kind of a unique position for both leaders, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, to have. So they have everything for them going, and so their leadership is helping them to move the country towards a better climate environment. I believe strongly that China and India are leading the world in terms of changing the world to actually be more sustainable. Now, this is not a story you hear much, but I believe if you see where they're coming from, what their intentions are, and the support they have, and actually the actions they do, it's really getting there. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. But the real issue is, and that's the question we never ask ourselves, what if China, Xi Jinping, or Narendra Modi would actually be a climate denier like Trump? And I don't want to say anything bad about Trump here, but the reality is, being a climate denier in one of those two countries, with most of the pollution happening there, would actually kill the whole planet. Imagine. We can't afford that. So we are lucky to say that both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi are actually not climate deniers. Well, in the US, I mean, they left the Paris Accord, Biden came back, we don't know what's going to happen in 2024, is Trump going to be in charge again? So we can't rely on the US anymore as we did before. Europe is a lot better. But China, it's clear, and India as well, once they pronounce this goal, I mean, they just keep at it. Now, I want to talk a little bit first about China, and I'll do India after that. If you look at China, the commitment to renewable energies is actually crazy. I mean, they're doing 4 to 5 times as much as the European Union, as the United States, or as India, in just creating the capacity of solar power, energy, like from wind, offshore, onshore, but also hydropower, hydrogen, any renewable energy is a massive investment that China is doing. Of course, they have the biggest problem as well on their hand, which is the biggest polluter and the factory of the world. But at the same time, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that they're doing 4 or 5 times better than we do in any region of the world. If you look at it from my perspective, how I've seen China evolved, I mean, they're the biggest producer, consumer, and user of renewable energies in the world. Today, they're also the biggest producers of electrical vehicles, with more than 50% of all the EVs, electrical vehicles, sold in China and actually manufactured in China. And if you look at planting trees, China and India together have planted more trees than the whole world together. And I could go on and on and on, like cities like Shenzhen that are completely electrified when it comes to public transport. So we're seeing the change happening on the ground. It's just not a story, it's more than that, it's actions. And so China is very much a top-down ecology strategy. What that means is that instead of what we do in the West, bottom-up change like Greta Thunberg and many people that are actually waking up the politicians, in China it's the politicians that are waking up the civilians or the citizens, although with the existential urgencies they don't always need to wake them up. What's interesting is that because of that, they can actually invest infrastructure at scale and at speed. And that makes the difference. Now, there's a really good book I read some time ago, which is called China Goes Green, which really explains what China has done over the past many, many years. Now, the downside of that is that specifically 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, you see that this top-down strategy is often a cookie-cutter actually strategy, which means that they don't always take into account the biodiversity. And it's more about scale and speed and fast transition. And that, of course, biodiversity is very important. Now, China's doing much better in the last years, but there's still a long way to go. But it is a very interesting way of looking at it. The question to ask ourselves is, does the world still have enough time to actually have a democratic system to make the transition of energy? Maybe we need that top-down strategy in order to save the planet. And I think China is on the right path there. Now, the other thing is that if you're a factory in China these days, you have to be very consistent to all the climate norms that are in China. If you're not, they're just going to close your factory. And so this is not just a theory. I mean, hundreds and thousands of factories are getting closed every year because they don't abide or they don't follow the norms that is being put into Beijing. And it's not just about the green factory of tomorrow, it's also about the green products of tomorrow, and that hits into the supply chain. What it means is that today China is poised to not just be the factory of the world, but actually be the green factory of the world. Everything we buy from China, everything we buy from green products is almost always coming from China. Whether it's water heaters or it's solar panels or whatever you name it, I mean 70–80% of the world's production comes from China. And this is just the beginning. I mean, electrical vehicles is another one. China is going to produce and is producing more and more. My statement, my belief is very strong. I believe that if the European Union and if America wants to decouple from China, they are never going to reach their own climate goals. And we can talk a long time about the fact that we want to be independent and we need to create our own energy production and our own solar panels and our own windmills and so on. We can talk about that, but the reality, the problem is going to be the next 10 years. If in the next 10 years, by 2030 for sure, we haven't bought enough products from China, we're simply never going to reach our climate goals. After that, it's a different story. So we should prepare for the after story, but we should also keep buying from China as much as possible. Otherwise, we're just not going to reach it. And so this is something we don't often talk about. We're going to have to make a decision. Do we want to reach our climate goals or do we want to decouple from China? But the biggest issue with these countries, China and India, is overpopulation. I mean, 1.4 billion people is just an issue. Why is it an issue? Because they all consume. And so when there's overconsumption, I mean, there's just overpollution. And so this is a reality. We've seen it in China go really skyrocket in amount of meat that they buy, and meat of course creates pollution as well because all these cows and so on and pigs create pollution. But on top of it, it's actually the factories that spend produce more products and people buy more products, and so there's a lot more pollution because they have cars and so on and so on and so on. China is no different from America. America is of course the worst student in the class. But the issue is that overconsumption is something we need to stop. Because if every person on this planet, the 8 billion people that we have, would all consume the same as an American does, it means we need 5 planets just to get the resources for all that consumption that would be needed. We don't have 5 planets, we have 1 planet, and we need to save it. And so the Americans are not giving the example to the rest of the world how to deal with overconsumption. Now, China's not doing a very great job there too, but it's a little bit better than the US. This is very different in India. In India, actually, there's much less overconsumption compared to China, America, or Europe. And why is that? Many would think it's because India is poor. But actually that's not what it's about. It's not the poverty that creates a situation that India is not over-consuming. It's actually a lifestyle. This is something that Indians for centuries and centuries have understood, that they shouldn't be over-consuming or actually consuming more than they need. And this comes back to the VEDIC or Vedic mindset. This is a mindset that is a culture, part of the culture of India, where basically it's kind of non-materialistic. It's kind of making sure that everything is sustainable and you live within a certain habitat and natural ecology or ecosystem that you live in. And so this mindset is basically very strong in Indian culture. And despite the fact that they could consume much more, they often don't. And that is the lesson we should learn from India. Actually, if you look at India, it's very clear that many families still rely on local production and seasonal food to actually consume. And this is part of the tradition. It's something they like. What they also do is recycle a lot of things. I mean, cotton is one example that is being reused over and over again for clothes, for carpets, basically for handbags, for whatever you use, but it's been reused often. And this recycling is actually, or the circular economy like we call it, is a natural habitat for Indians. On top of that, when they build things, which is one of the biggest polluters, is construction in many countries in the world, in all countries of the world, well, many of the original buildings and many of the buildings in the countryside are very eco-friendly. And this is about reusal again, but it's also about using materials that are not polluting. And this is not something they've learned, it's something they've been doing for centuries, and so they know this by default. On top of that, there's a lot of conservation. And this is something we can really learn from India. One of the main reasons is because of water. I mean, water is in shortage, or it means that there's a lot of water at certain times and then there's no water or no rainfall for a long time as well. So over the centuries, over the decades, India has learned to preserve and conserve the water and use it when they need it and catch it when there's actually too much. And so this mindset is all part of tradition, it's part of the culture, it's part of the habits of India. This is something that the rest of the world can learn from. And that brings me to Narendra Modi, who's actually like 80% of all the Indians of Hindu faith. And he's leading the BJP, which is the largest party in India and the leading party, but also the largest party in the world. It's even bigger than the Communist Party of China, with more than 100 million followers or members. And so this is about the Hindu or Hindutva ideology. And this comes back or goes back to Gandhi. It really goes back to Gandhi's idea of non-materialistic and non-individualistic mindset, and basically a way of living or a lifestyle which have everything to do with moderation and conservation. And so this is about being in harmony with nature. This is not new. This is from 1947's Indians' independence, that actually this party is already promoting this kind of mindset. And so the whole government today is entrenched with having more harmony with nature. It's just natural part of what their policies are about. And this is something we don't have in the West as much. I mean, we have green parties, but the reality is that in India, the main party is actually a green party. And Narendra Modi actually very clearly in 2022, last year, created a new movement based on that, based on the Hindu way of respecting the planet and being in harmony with nature and loving or being part of that environment. It's really something that is called L.I.F.E. He called it L.I.F.E, or the Lifestyle for Environment movement. And this is what he calls the pro-planet people. He wants the pro-planet people to actually gather together, gather the brains together, come up with new ideas, new concepts for people to learn how to actually be more conscious about their consumption, be more conscious about their lifestyle, be more conscious about their link to nature. And so this is not just a simple movement like there's many movements. Actually, it's the biggest country in the world in terms of population, with all the support of the population that believes that this is the way forward, and many countries are following that idea. And I believe personally, if we would change our lifestyle and life habits like the Indians are, I mean, we would have a much easier task to save the planet. Now, of course, Modi has a lot to talk for, because if you look at his track record for the past 8 years of being a prime minister, I mean, it's very clear that he's been doing great things. And so he can pack out, he can really show for the world that this is working. I mean, India, on one hand, is actually going to be requesting more than 25% of all the energy demand growth. So it means, together with Southeast Asia and China, it's actually 70% of the energy demand growth. So it means if India can show the way forward, if China can show the way forward, actually it's very important, because that's where the growth of energy will come from. But also, if you look at just the climate goals of the Paris Accords of 2015, what you see, and this is remarkable, is that India is one of the few countries that is on track of reaching its goals. I mean, most of the Western countries, they talk about it, but they don't reach the steps in between those goals and the final step. So the likelihood of them reaching, Europe, for example, by 2050 carbon zero is very unlikely if you don't reach the steps in between, and India is doing that. On top of that, if you look at the capacity of energy that India has been increasing over the past years of Modi, the 8 years of his governance, you see that it tripled 300 times what it used to be before. And then he has the preservation of tigers that he did like no one before. I mean, there's a lot of tigers now, more than double this population in just 8 years' time. On top of that, and if you look at forestation, I mean, India in the last 8 years has created for 20,000 kilometers in new green trees in the country. I mean, it's amazing. So India and Modi can say, well, you see what we've done. I mean, it's clear that we can do it. If we can do it as a poor country, because India in a way is still a poor country for many areas, I mean, then anybody should be able to do it. But somehow we don't look too much at what they've done. But why Modi really got the support, in my view, has to do with the change of the population. And we were talking about more than 20 million people over the past 8 years when Modi was in charge, or is in charge, that we've seen that now they have affordable houses. Before they didn't have a house, no roof on top of their heads. You see that women now everywhere, or many places, have public toilets, something that was terrible before. And then if you look at financial inclusion, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Often we talk about 400 million people that are now included in the financial system. Basically, they can pay and receive money, and before that they didn't even have a bank account. And that, of course, creates a lot of support from 1.4 billion people that Modi is really aimed for a transition that is good for their lives, for their future, and for the planet in itself. And so Modi and India today, in 2023, is chairing the G20. And this is very important because every year there's a G20. It used to be in Indonesia last year, and this year it's actually Modi and India who's chairing it. And why is this important? It's important because that's where actually the 20 leaders of the world are gathering together, but more so because Modi has put sustainability and saving the planet as the top of the agenda. And primarily in the global south, we'll see that both China and India are going to compete, and that's a good thing, to actually attract countries to actually follow their lead and to pressure the global north or the west to actually follow suit. And so I think 2023 could really be a very important moment for India to show to the world, with the L.I.F.E movement and other initiatives and actions that they're doing, how it's possible to save the world. Now, I believe, to summarize, that China can really teach the world how to save the planet. And I also believe India can guide and coach us how we should change our life in order to save the planet. From China, it's very clear we can learn so much from the policies, from the incentives, as well as from everything they've done into the infrastructure and investment, and the speed and scale that they've done is just amazing. If we would all be doing this in Europe and America, we probably wouldn't be talking about saving the planet anymore, because it would be a natural fact in itself. But for India, we could learn a lot about how to change our life, how to be more conscious of the lifestyle, how to be more in harmony with the planet, how to respect the planet more, and basically be more of an environment where we actually feel it's about moderation and conservation, and not just about more. And so I think both countries can teach us a lot. And if we in Europe, if we in America, if we in the West would be open enough to look at both countries and learn from that, I think we have a better chance to save the planet. The problem with that is there's two things that we need to do. First of all, we cannot afford to decouple from China in the next 10 years to come. So we can create plans to do that in the future, and we can do incentives, and it's all good to have green deals, and it's good to have IRA and or the Inflation Reduction Act and all these things that actually are creating jobs and creating green production. That is good. The problem is that we should actually not do that in order to decouple from China. We should do both in parallel and mainly keep China as a factory until we save the planet, not our economy. The second thing is actually that we can learn from India how they have changed their lifestyle, or are changing the lifestyle, basically to be more conservative. And this is where I think the only condition to do that is to be open towards tradition, to be open towards what India has taken 5 centuries, or 50 centuries, you could say 5,000 years actually, to learn in order to teach us how a planet and how a society and how civilization can be sustained. And so I think we need to learn from both. And so my wish for the world is actually that we look more at India, we look more at China to see the good things they're doing when it comes to the environment, the good things they're doing in terms of making that transition, and not just talk about the coal and the problems, because that is true, but this is a phase that they need to get through. But at the same time, their ambition to make a difference is very, very clear. And so for me, if we are open enough, and if we're willing to communicate and collaborate with China and India, I think the world still has a chance to save the planet.